So good afternoon on behalf of SEPS. Welcome to this webinar on the global vaccines response. And as we all see, we read, we hear about this all the time. And of course, there is the European reaction, but also today we will be discussing the global reaction, because as we expect, the world may look a bit different after this COVID crisis. And we are very happy that we can have this webinar with several renowned speakers. Michelle still has to join us, Michelle Goldman, who was a former director of the European Innovative Medicines Initiative, which is a EU-funded body which also looks into research for vaccines. But we have the two other speakers already there, Jajati and Miguel Ceballos. Jajati, who's I think Andrea will introduce her in a moment, and then Miguel will do, also Miguel, he'll do the same. But I would just wanted to first introduce what SEPS is doing on this, and I'm very happy that Andrea can moderate the seminar, because Andrea is for SEPS coordinating a huge program related to the post-COVID response by the EU, funded also in the context of the Horizon programs, which will look at, he can say something about this in a moment, at the global, the EU's response and the implication for governance, European governance, but also global governance in this respect. But also not only that, he's also recently attracted interest from the ECDC, the European Center for Disease Control, to help them, let's say, in structuring this response to this crisis. Again, he can say something in a moment about this. But just to say that we at SEPS, even if we're focusing mostly on economic policy issues, are also looking very closely at the health policy matters as a result of this crisis. And I think Andrea, with his team, the unit here in SEPS he's managing, is at the center of this. Without further ado, I pass the floor to Andrea, who can introduce this debate, as we only have 1 hour and we want to get it through. Andrea.
Thank you very much, Carol, for the nice introduction. And I will also be very short because we want to hear from our speakers today. Yes, indeed, at SEPS, as a European think tank, or a think tank devoted to the study of the EU as a global actor, we study obviously the economic policy, the social policies in particular that are developed and implemented by the EU, but we're also extremely interested in studying the EU as a geopolitical actor, or in some cases geoeconomic actor. And this has led us over time also to look at the way in which the European Union projects itself into the global community in various policy domains, because this happens in different ways depending on the competences, the organization, the internal governance of the EU, and the instruments that the EU uses in interacting with the rest of the world. We're also interested, obviously, in global public goods and in how the global community organizes to achieve, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals, and how, obviously, from our European perspective, the EU can push further that agenda. Now, here, obviously, we are talking about something that is very peculiar. We are 1 year, more than a year from the official declaration of the COVID-19 as a global pandemic. And we are witnessing something that is phenomenal and spectacular, the fact that there have been vaccines developed in record time and ready for distribution. But there's always something that happens when the global community needs to mobilize to develop something that would be truly the result of solidarity and a really pervasive distribution of the vaccines. We are seeing a number of trends that are not necessarily in line with what a full vaccine solidarity would lead us to expect, right? And to some extent, the EU is a little bit squeezed in the middle of this because it has internal tensions to a large extent, an uphill battle to keep member states together that is not just a one-off, but it's a continuous effort. It has some geopolitical competition coming in from the fact that the EU is indeed, in this moment, lagging behind in vaccine distribution, if you look at the US or even the UK, obviously, which is an inevitable point of comparison for the EU. And there's also the broader tensions between the values that the EU stands for and what is actually happening on the ground, in particular for what concerns developing countries. There is also the issue of the geopolitical tensions with China and Russia, with the internal fragmentation of the EU, with some countries starting to recognize or even committing to produce some of the vaccines, in particular the Russian vaccines in some European countries, or accepting, authorizing, and administering Chinese and Russian vaccines. So it is a bit of a messy situation. And in all this situation, what is clear is that there are some parts of the world in which there might not be a vaccine for all before 2024, perhaps. Whereas in other parts of the world, the race is to be ready maybe for the 4th of July and be all vaccinated. And in all of this, the scenarios that we see unfolding are potentially either optimistic, but perhaps for the wrong reason, or that maybe there will be a stepping up of this action at the global level, just because there is a turf war, even in developing countries, to avoid, for example, that some global powers make inroads in developing countries, for example, China and Russia vis-a-vis the United States. So perhaps stepping up competition in developing and administering vaccines, perhaps for the wrong reasons, meaning for a geopolitical war, or maybe a more optimistic scenario where there is a final convergence on the realization of the fact that no one is going to be safe unless everyone is safe, and that it is a right, and it is an ethical and really and moral imperative, the prioritization of vaccine distribution to each and every person in the globe. So in order to discuss this, and how do we put some order in this, we have 3 fantastic speakers. So I will not take more than another minute just to introduce our first speaker, and then I will introduce them as they take the floor. So our first speaker will be Professor Jayati Ghosh. And Jayati is now with the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, previously at JNU until the end of last year in New Delhi. Jayati is a very well-known figure in economics, but also in global development. Last time I met her, we were discussing labor conditions in developing countries. So also very active in a very broad range of issues related to human development at the global level. Jayati is also a member of the Commission on Global Economic Transformation. And I wanted to mention this because this commission that is co-chaired by Michael Spence and Joe Stiglitz is producing a report on the pandemic and the economic crisis, a global agenda for urgent action that contains a number of very bold action items and really important insights into what the global community should do in order to accelerate the distribution of vaccines, but also development and lifting out of a worrying trend, the majority of people in the world that are currently being severely hit by the crisis. So Jayati, we're extremely happy that you're with us today. And I'm gonna give you the floor to start talking about this global vaccine distribution issue and how you see it from your perspective. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much, Andrea, and it's a real pleasure to meet you again and also to be with you in this panel. So, you know, I think this pandemic has really shown not just how unequal the world is, but how we are not really a global community. It's true, we all keep saying that no one is safe till everyone is safe, but these sound like platitudes because they are so not implemented by government policies. What have we seen? And vaccines is the sort of quintessential extreme example of this. We have seen an unseemly vaccine grab by the rich countries to the point where when the first 3 were given regulatory approval, that is Pfizer, Moderna, and AstraZeneca, the developed countries had grabbed 84% of this year's supply, 2021 supply, even though they account for only 14% of global population. Within the first month, they had made the pre-orders. There is an international facility, the COVAX, which was set up by WHO, Gavi, and another group specifically to avoid this vaccine grab, to ensure equitable distribution. And these countries are members of COVAX, but they bypassed COVAX and went into bilateral side deals so that they could grab vaccines for their own population. This, I think, of course, it's unseemly, but it's ridiculous because then many countries have been quite inefficient in distributing it within their own population. So having grabbed it, some are actually stockpiling them, some are not able to get it across, some are throwing them and wasting them. It's bizarre. 130 countries have not had a single vaccination yet against COVID-19. So it tells you the extent of the disparity. But I think what is most significant is that this is an artificial scarcity. The European Union today, countries are fighting among themselves. They're complaining that the EU has not been efficient in acquiring vaccines. Yet the shortage is an artificial shortage. It is because we have first funded multinational pharma companies to do this very rapid vaccine development, which is all to the good, it's excellent. But having done that, we are then not requiring them to share their knowledge and intellectual property, which would be obvious because these are all done with publicly funded research. All of them have benefited from either massive government subsidies or prepayment for sales, which has more than covered their costs and given them pretty good profits already. Pfizer is anticipating 14 billion of profits today, this year, when its costs for development were estimated to be maximum 4 billion. And why is that? It's because we persist, or rather the developed countries persist, in pushing for patent rights, for intellectual property rights that inhibit other producers. We have enough production capacity in the world. There are companies across the developing world that could make these vaccines and produce enough to vaccinate the entire global population this year. Why are we not doing it? Because the developed countries are resisting a proposal in the WTO brought by India, South Africa, but supported by 70% of WTO members to actually suspend intellectual property rights during the period of the pandemic. This is a public health emergency. The WTO allows for it. And in fact, this is going against the populations of the rich countries. The governments are just promoting the interests of big pharma companies to maintain their monopoly patent rights, which, let us face it, at this point, they are misusing and abusing. And this is the moment at which everybody else in the world, governments who would pay less for the vaccines, people who would get access to the vaccines, even people in rich countries, everybody else would benefit. So it's very important for people, even in the European Union, to realize that it's not just a question of global standing, it's even good for you to get these vaccines more quickly and to be able to inoculate your entire population if we suspend these intellectual property rights. Finally, I just want to say that, there is a sense in which this pandemic has dramatically reduced the European Union standing in the world. Think of what it looks like to a developing country, where you see them squabbling amongst themselves, these countries complaining that this country has grabbed that and that country has, we are not getting enough and so on, when they are systematically out there denying the rest of the world. It is a very, very unfortunate thing. The commission that was just mentioned by Andrea, the Commission on Global Economic Transformation, has just come out with a report with Professor Stiglitz, Professor Spence, and a bunch of other people, including myself, in which this is one of the essential points. The idea that we have to get away from vaccine nationalism and move towards suspension of intellectual property rights for this period, it's absolutely essential. And it has to be combined with other expressions of global solidarity, which will actually cost the rich countries very, very little. A big expansion of SDR, suspension of debt, which is frankly unpayable at this point. All of these are things that are very low cost for rich countries. But the vaccine issue in particular, I think until people really do realize that if they don't do something now, they are going to be losers themselves in the medium term, I think that's absolutely essential.
Indeed, thanks a lot, Jayati. And so what you're pointing at is what we would call the opportunity cost that is emerging of not speeding up the distribution of and the administration of vaccines at the global level. And also you've called into question the role that the EU is playing. So maybe later on, I will ask you, Jayati, to go a little bit more in depth into the intellectual property aspects and the TRIPS agreement but potentially also what the provisions that were already in there or the provisions that could be introduced in the future to clarify the framework for waiving intellectual property rights and patent protection in case of a health emergency like the one that we are going through. So I will now, I turn to Miguel Ceballos Baron, because I think what you said also about the current, let's say, positioning of the European Union and the reputational effects of this whole situation on the European Union are something that Miguel is well equipped to tackle, not only because Miguel is working actively in DG Health on this issue, but also because in the past, Miguel, you've been working on issues related to trade, issues related to intellectual property, and issues related to relationship with China. So you have a career that really makes you the perfect person to tackle this issue. Help us understand also the many different tensions that the EU is subject to at the moment, and how do you see this unfolding in terms of the EU potentially shaping its position in the global order? So thanks for being with us, Miguel. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrea. Good afternoon, everyone. Indeed, it's been a pleasure for me being invited to this event with CEPS. Thank you for hosting. And it's a real pleasure to go back to one of my favorite topics, that was access to medicines under WTO. I was working as a young commission official with Commissioner Lamy at the time, when the initiative was launched in 2001 to give access to medicines to developing countries. So it was funny that almost 20 years after, the issue comes back, and I'm very pleased to be dealing with that. But today I wanted to make a few points on the EU response following the title of the event today. So as you know, and it's good that we are now commemorating 1 year of the start of the pandemic. And 1 year ago, right now, day by day, the European Union response was not a response as a union. It was individual member states, and even inside some member states, individual regions or communities responded, because health is national competence or regional competence in some federal states. So the reaction in the EU institutions was, we don't have competence, there is little we can do. That was the initial reaction when thinking this is a purely health issue, a virus that is coming from China, like SARS, will probably be contained at some point. So we trust the member states' health systems will deal with that. While soon we saw that that was not a classical virus epidemic, but it was a real pandemic. And when the challenge is huge, everyone turns into the EU for help and a response. With our hands a little bit tied because the limited competences on the field, but when we immediately saw that some member states were closing the borders, affecting the free movement of people, of goods, that the shelves in the supermarkets were empty, that the supply chains were disrupted, the impact on the economy, and the need for the European Investment Bank to intervene, to grant broad exceptions to the state aid rules, then definitely there was no way the EU would not step in this problem. It took a little bit of time. I mean, the initial reaction was, of course, of a reflection on how to act. And in the beginning of April, the Commission reacted with a very extensive ease of competition, state aid rules, allowing member states to support the economy, looking into ways of keeping the borders open, in particular for the traffic of goods, to ensure that equipment, not only personal protective equipment that was so much needed, but also food, all the supplies were flowing with no interruption. So the Commission start acting, taking decisions, and then also start looking into funding, because there was a need to mobilize funding because everybody was under stress. So the Commission found 3 billion euro under the emergency support instrument, made all the necessary to make this funding available for countries. The global response, let's remember that a year ago, the US administration was a different one, with a president in the White House, Mr. Trump, that had a different perception of the world. So we found ourselves somehow leading the response to the pandemic, with the United States that have already announced that it was withdrawing from the WHO precisely in the middle of the pandemic, with China and Russia doing their own bilateral diplomacy. The rest of the world turned their eyes into the European Union for some leadership. And this is why at the end of April, the European Commission, WHO, launched the ACT Accelerator, the first coalition on response to the pandemic, trying to mobilize funding and support to develop vaccines, medicines, and therapeutics to fight the virus. And the Commission hosted several pledging conferences, mobilizing funds. That was very helpful. That was very good. One of the pillars of the ACT Accelerator was COVAX, that Professor Jayati has mentioned. Again, a coalition of countries willing to put resources into research for a vaccine and to purchase together the vaccine. Now, with the distance, with the time distance, now we can say that the level of ambition of COVAX at the time was really high, pretending to be able to put together all the countries in the world, buying together vaccines for COVID that did not exist. That was a big, big challenge. Still, the European Union supported from the beginning, politically, financially, diplomatically, encouraging members to join. And the good news is that today, COVAX is delivering. We have seen the first doses coming, but the way until today has been a difficult one. In the meantime, considering the particular needs of the European Union, considering that the initial response in March, April, with our member states authorities hoarding, chasing the markets to get masks, ventilators, all kind of health equipment, that was really unfortunate. That only provoked scarcity, prices going up, completely divided response, and we learned a lesson. And the lesson was that when developing the vaccine and buying the vaccine, we should do it united together. So we launched in June the vaccine strategy, basically saying we have to procure a successful vaccine together. We have to rely on the expertise epidemiologists in member states and do that together. This has been an unprecedented success for the European Union. This is the best of the pandemic at EU level, is precisely that we've been able to make such a big procurement, more than 2.7 billion euro spent by the EU budget alone, and that's only one fraction of the total cost of the contracts. Negotiated by the Commission on behalf of the 27 member states, we have put together a portfolio of the most successful vaccines, which is easy to say because at the beginning, back in July, there were around 145 vaccines under development, under research. Well, thanks to the experts we have all around Europe, we managed to identify the very best, including those with new technologies like mRNA that were completely unknown, untested, and created more questions than answers. Would that technology be efficacious, safe? Would the industry be able to produce these vaccines from zero? Well, our experts, they have discussed long time, as you can imagine. And at the end of the day, we put a balanced portfolio of vaccines with different technologies, working with companies with different manufacturing capacity. And most important, this is something that we like to stress today, the European Union has put an incredibly big amount of public funding into this project, only comparable to the public funding put forward by the United States. Thanks to that, today we have successful vaccines that save lives, that protect people, that are safe and efficacious, and also produce in big quantities. Not enough, fully agree, it's not enough, but this is only possible thanks to the public money that the European Union and United States have put into that. If today we have not put all this money into investment in manufacturing of vaccines and development, there will be no vaccine in record time, as you said at the beginning, Carol. Now, on the geostrategic implications, I will also say a few words on IPR because this is one of my favorite topics. On the geostrategic dimensions, there is a complete misperception of the vaccine diplomacy and vaccine nationalism. I give the facts. I cannot give you the figures, but I give you the facts. The European Union is the largest COVID vaccine supplier in the world. We have produced millions, tens of millions of vaccines that have been sent to more than 40 countries. High income, low income countries all around. There is no similar effort. I mean, you will see a lot of photos from Chinese vaccines landing in Africa and or Russian Sputnik in South America. Fine. Look at the figures. Count how many countries get it, how many doses. I mean, Benin got 25 Sputnik vaccines. It was all in the news, first page in the newspapers, on TV, newspapers, etc. Fine. This is what we call propaganda. Fine. I mean, they have the right to do so. But the real work, the real global effort is being made by the European Union, supplying, as I said, I cannot give you the precise figure because it's still sensitive, but tens of millions of vaccines delivered to more than 40 countries. And we don't put the European flag into the boxes because there is no need. We do that because we believe in open markets, in supplying to the rest of the world. At the same time, there is big production in the United States, zero vaccines to any other country. All the vaccines stay in the United States. The president of the European Council said that clearly the other day regarding United States and the United Kingdom. The European Union is the only global supplier and will continue to do so because we believe on open markets that we all have to share the burden of supporting and helping all countries. And equally, these vaccines are also flowing through COVAX. On IPR, I agree with Professor Jati. I mean, there is no global community. This is an evidence. COVAX has been an effort, but I think it's been very close to that. I think I'm very proud of what COVAX has done. I'm sitting in the COVAX governance. I follow that day by day. I'm very proud of the success. Could be better. Always, you can always improve. But seeing the first vaccines roll out in Africa is a great, it's a lot of pride. I don't think the problem is IPR or patent waiver. I understand that Moderna has waived the patent for the COVID vaccine. And no? Okay. Well, the problem is the transfer of technology, capital investment.
That's the point, isn't it? The point is the transfer of technology.
Exactly. So why are we wasting time on patent waiver in WTO when we know that this is not the issue? Because there is nothing you can do with a patent in vaccines. In medicines, you can do a lot. You can produce a molecule, you can produce a drug based on a patent, but you cannot produce a vaccine. It's more complex than that. Now, I just was half a minute. The companies that are making big profit, they are delighted and they are looking desperately for partners in all around the world to produce the vaccines under license and transfer technology. The Serum Institute of India, the largest vaccine manufacturer, is producing COVID vaccines with no problem because it has made at least license agreements with AstraZeneca or Oxford University and Novavax. Leomont in Mexico is doing the AstraZeneca with the drug substance made in Argentina. Fosun in China is doing is manufacturing the BioNTech vaccine. So licensing and transfer technology is happening because it's good business, not because we governments or NGOs tell them to do it. They do it because they believe it is the best way for business and helping to the world. I stop there. I think I planned some.
Thanks, Miguel, for a very, very comprehensive overview, which I am sure will trigger more debates. But since we have gone also into technical issues and scientific issues, I think it's very good that we have with us Professor Michel Goldman. He is the founder and co-director of the I3H Institute, the Institute for Interdisciplinary Innovation in Healthcare, that he actually manages and co-directs with an economist, Professor de Vatripon, and he is also professor at ULB here in Brussels, and he was the executive director of the IMI, the Innovative Medicines Initiative at the EU level. So Professor Goldman, thanks for being with us. I am extremely curious at this point to hear your point of view on the two quite diverging perspectives that we've heard so far. And maybe you can help us put some order in between those two viewpoints. Thanks for being with us. You are muted. Please turn on your microphone. Yep. Yes.
Sorry. So thank you very much for the invitation and the introduction. You know, I would like to start with what the real success, which is the science. I think that in terms of science, pure science, this has been a real triumph. When you think that in less than a year, we had vaccines available and given to patients, this is just unbelievable. I think it's important to remember why and how collaboration has been key, including collaboration involving European scientists. Let's remember that collaboration started because Chinese scientists, within a few weeks, published the genome sequence of the virus. And on this basis, several laboratories, including European laboratories at the University of Oxford and also in BioNTech, were able to immediately start to produce vaccine candidates. Why was it so? Because they had vaccines for other disease ready. The technological platforms were there. So it was just a question to change the genetic material from one virus to the other. And since they were producing vaccines against other very closely related coronavirus, I would say that for them it was like a piece of cake, at least to produce the first vaccine candidates. And I think it's important to remember that these two teams, laboratory, were in Europe, had been funded in Europe. And it's true that in parallel, there was the NIH team in the US, which would give rise to Moderna. So after that, it went really very fast for the first preclinical investigation, then the clinical trials. And I must say that also the regulatory agencies, both in the US and in Europe, played the game so that the vaccines were ready to be injected in large populations, as I said, in less than a year. So that's really a triumph. Now, in huge contrast with this triumph of science, you have a number of failures, and I will focus on the European failures. And perhaps you would be surprised, but the first failure I will mention, I am MD by training, is a failure in terms of clinical investigations, clinical trials. Because, okay, we had the vaccines which were developed to get the regulatory approval, but at the same time, there were so many drugs which were tested as antivirals. You remember, obviously, the hydroxychloroquine story, but there were other stories. And there, I must say that the way all these clinical trials were conducted, it's really a shame for the community of clinical scientists. Too many trials, too few patients in each trial which didn't which didn't come to an end because it was too slow. And at the end of the day, I mean, very few positive results. And the reality is that the meaningful observations were made, we can say today, outside Europe. Actually, in the United Kingdom, there is this recovery platform, which has been really extremely efficient, providing the key information that dexamethasone, a glucocorticoid, was indeed improving so much the prognosis. There has been a few other meaningful observations, but I would say that most of them were done outside the European Union. Despite the fact that we had clinical networks, we had the European project, we were supposed to provide meaningful information, it didn't work. For reasons that we can discuss later on. I think that unfortunately, there was a number of considerations driving the way those clinical trials were conducted. And I must say that the ego of some clinical trialists is part of the explanation. Now, let's discuss what was happening in terms of the global EU response. You know, the European Commission produced a number of recommendations. And if you had time, just have a look at those recommendations. They are quite remarkable. Look at what they propose for contact tracing. We were not able to unify in any way the way we trace the patients, not in any way. Look after the first wave about their recommendation, will we lift containments? Very nice document, well done, explaining what the Commission, the European Union, is expecting from each member state to prepare itself to lift containment measure to prepare for the London exit. This was very well written, very well conceived, but not applied, or in a very heterogeneous way at the best. Look at the test. Do you know how many tests we have now to measure, I mean, to detect the virus, to look at immunization of antibodies? Again, very good recommendation. How shall we develop rapid antigenic tests? All these things. And again, you know, it was complete, each country, each member state took his own approach. So I think that we have really to learn of this. And you could say, okay, with vaccine, and I agree with what Miguel said, there is a good initiative, and you can name it a success. I would be careful. I think that it's true that after some countries start to work, I think there were 4 or 5, trying to create a small consortium to buy the vaccine, then the European Commission took it over. This was a nice initiative. And I think that at the same time, the Commission was very careful to say, okay, look, we have also to care for other parts of the world. So we will buy the vaccine, but we will take care that vaccines are used, you know, everywhere. So that was very generous, but I'm afraid a bit naive, because they spend quite a lot of time in negotiating, probably good commercial conditions, but time was lost. And I will not go into details, but I was in a position to look at the way indeed science was associated, I would say not associated with the choice of the vaccine. It was not an easy process, but I'm really not convinced by the way it was done. And actually, you can read a number of documents, and the last interview that I read from Guido Razi, the former executive director of the European Medicine Agency, is quite illuminating. I think that the idea was generous. I think that they did quite well, but I think that when you are confronted with such a pandemic And when you are confronted with people from Big Pharma, which obviously are negotiating in the hard way, I mean, I'm not sure that we were prepared the best way for this negotiation. But still, we have vaccines, that's true. However, we don't have enough vaccines. And, you know, it's true that we were very proud to have a portfolio of vaccine. And it's true that at the time, we didn't know which vaccine could work. But when you look at the current situation, we are far behind, you know, obviously Israel, but also the United Kingdom, also the United States. So I think that what was happening there was, I think by and large, we can consider this as a failure to achieve the objective to have a maximum of people immunized in as rapidly as possible. And it will not be easy to overcome this. Now, look at what was happening in comparison in the United States. You know, in the United States, they just decide to use the most efficient tools and instruments they had through the so-called BARDA agency, which allowed to directly provide support to production, manufacturing, deployment of vaccines. And without, you know, much negotiation, they decide that they would take a scientific industrialist, Moncef Slaoui, and a military, a general, and they say, okay, let's go and do what we need to achieve the goal. So this was really straightforward. And it's quite interesting to see that although UK has been very bad, I would say at the very beginning, since a few months, they also appoint one person who was extremely active, directive. I think that the army was also involved to some extent. So I think that Europe was not able to use or to create fit for purpose instrument to address the challenge as compared to the United States. Now, it's really a missed opportunity because you can think that in the context of this pandemic, and there are beautiful sentences in French, I will not quote them, from a Nobel laureate for in the, I think it was 1900 something, explaining that, you know, human beings are all brothers. They are all engaged in the same battle. I mean, the enemy is the same, and so on. If you want, I will send you later the exact quote. But it's a beautiful sentence, and it was really a nice opportunity to say, look, as Europeans, we are in different member states, but we are engaged in the same battle, in the same process. And I'm afraid it's just the opposite which happened. And I think now is the time to learn from these lessons. And it's where, obviously, we could hope that this new agency era will make the difference. And we will see how it goes. I must say that the way it started, I'm quite skeptical because the European Commission just used the usual process of impact assessment. All the lobbying parties are preparing their response to the impact assessment. So again, it looks a bit like business as usual. However, I think that things might change because there was one important point, which, and I think that this point was addressed, which is the manufacturing capacities in Europe. And I think that if this is used as a starting point, let's make sure that we anchor in Europe the production capacities, the manufacturing expertise. This could be a starting point. And then from there, we can discuss and reflect what we need in terms of the new science and all these things. But if we start with this very practical aspect of manufacturing and deployment of the pharma product, that would be, I think, it could be a game changer.
No, I'm afraid.
I would like to end by addressing the question of IP and how do we address the partnership with the pharma. And there I have perhaps a more balanced view. I'm convinced that we need the pharma, we need the big pharma, especially when it's come to scaling up, producing, incredible quantities, deploying all these things. They have this expertise. And I think that if we have to do it on our own, on the public side, it will not work for a number of reasons. I think that the management, organization, production capacities of pharma are important. And obviously on the public side, we need imagination, the creativity, all these things. And that's why we need the partnership. Now, the way pharma works, obviously, I mean, they have to make profit. As you know, as for years, they are doing quite large profit. And I think that what we should discuss with them is their statements, which were done by a number of CEO organizations, such as the Business Roundtable and others. So now more and more pharma say, we are not there only to please our shareholders. We have a societal responsibility. This is what they are claiming. Fine, let's discuss how we translate this into practice. And interestingly enough, if you look at AstraZeneca and Janssen, they are committed to produce, at least in the first phase of the pandemic, we will see later, they claim at least that they produce the vaccines at cost. It's true that, what they are charging seem, let's say, reasonable for those who know a bit what is behind. So I think that I would agree that IP is not the real or the major bottleneck. It doesn't mean that we don't have to discuss about this, but I don't think it's a major bottleneck. I think that what we should really discuss is indeed the pricing and how this partnership can be organized in a balanced way. I will stop here and I can elaborate more later.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Professor Goldman. You will get at least another chance. We have now 10 minutes, unfortunately, so we need to be efficient. What I propose to do is that I will go back to the speakers in the same order, but I will add, so obviously they can comment further on what has been said. I'm sure Jayati, for example, has something to say about what has been said after her presentation, but I will add something else because we have 3 questions in the Q&A. Well, 2 questions actually, and Fabio Colasanti was asking something you might want to comment on as part of your next round of presentation. So he says 5 countries are clearly doing better than the EU in terms of vaccination of their population, USA, UK, UAE, Israel, and Bahrain. But the rest of the world, from Canada to Argentina, Brazil, have vaccinated smaller shares of the population than the EU. So there are some champions, but let's not forget the whole picture. So perhaps this goes more in the direction that you were painting, so the landscape that you were painting. And he adds the champions have acted in a way that perhaps that we are not prepared to follow. So maybe you can take that into account in your next, let's say, 2-3 minutes of comments. Thanks, Jayati.
Thank you so much, and I will be brief because I realize we don't have too much time left. On the issue of intellectual property rights, it is absolutely correct, as both Miguel and Mr. Goldman pointed out, that we absolutely need the transfer of technology. That's the basic problem, right? The reason why they are asking for a waiver of intellectual property rights in general in the WTO is because that is the only way in which you will actually push these companies into transfer of technology. It is not done voluntarily. The agreements that were mentioned in terms of, Serum Institute and etc., these are very, very limited, and the pricing is still in the hands of the multinational. And it is actually something which is giving, let's face it, monopolistic or oligopolistic power to these companies. AstraZeneca, for example, is pricing differently. It's charging South Africa $5.25 per dose compared to $3.50 in the European Union. It's charging more in a developing country. So I think there is a real case in which the WHO has the CTAP, the COVID-19 Technology Access Pool. Only 40 countries have joined. They're all developing countries who don't have intellectual property. The countries that matter, the ones that are homes of the companies that have the knowledge, which is publicly funded knowledge, they do not join. Now, we have to remember, as was pointed out by both, this is fundamentally the result of massive public investments. In the EU, in Europe, in China, in Russia, in all the countries that have developed vaccines, public investment dominated in vaccine development. How is it that we have got all this public subsidy without requiring these companies to do anything, without putting conditions on sharing technology? In fact, for AstraZeneca, we had the opposite. Oxford was prepared to make it publicly available. They shifted and moved it entirely to AstraZeneca and a private deal, which monopolized that knowledge. The making available of this knowledge is the only way for rapid universal vaccination within as short a time as possible. To say that we're giving a few million here, I'm sorry, it sounds so patronizing and so appalling about, we're giving some and so we are good and generous and the US is not, okay, they are selfish. I'm selfish, but they are more selfish than we are. Really? I don't think it's a question of just, being generous and kind. It's a question of your own self-interest. If you get mutations, you're going to be in bad shape. Please recognize this. It's a health issue. In addition, forget the ethics of it for now. Forget how good and kind European Union is being in comparison to the US. That's really not the issue. It's a global health pandemic. The virus can mutate and does mutate. The more you delay vaccinating the entire population, the greater the chances of this, the greater it may come back to bite you. The only thing that is preventing this is the lack of transfer of technology. And, it's not an act of generosity. These are publicly funded. Compulsory licensing does not mean these companies will stop getting profits. A global kind of compulsory license will mean they will get reasonable profits on sharing this technology, on giving the licenses. So you're not depriving them of further profits. You're simply saying, we're keeping it reasonable. We're enabling many, many more producers. That's really all it is. So I think that's number one. I think there was a question on excess vaccine supply. Canada has already repurchased 10 times its population. The US, 4 times its population. Europe, I think it's just double, but some countries, it's about 4 or 5 times the population. And then they say, well, when we're finished, we will distribute the excess vaccine supply. Just think of what this is doing. This is forcing all other countries who are trying to buy vaccines to be back at the bottom of the queue. And then when all of you have benevolently decided that you've done enough for your own population, you're going to distribute the rest in a God knows when, in 2022, at least, because you're being very inefficient in your own internal distribution. And it really means that more and more countries will be denied. I just want to, a final point, I think COVAX is great. I think the idea is great. I think the fact that it exists is a brilliant thing. There are 3 flaws, 2 of which I think are design flaws. But the first flaw is that it's underfunded. It wanted 6.8 billion, which is already a really low ambition. It has got only 4 billion so far. But clearly it should get double that amount. It should get at least 14, 15 billion if it's thinking seriously of providing vaccines for the whole world. But I think the design flaws are that first, it did not prohibit side deals by member countries, and we are now experiencing the result. And the second is that the purchase agreements of COVAX are opaque. We don't know the conditions, the deals that are being made by different companies, and that allows all kinds of other side deals to happen. I'm really grateful to Mr. Goldman for this very insightful discussion of the role of science. I think that was very, very important. And I'm so happy that he mentioned the fact that the Chinese very quickly shared the genetic details of that virus, because that has been absolutely crucial. But I also think that the rapidity of the global regulatory response is something that is remarkable. Vaccines take 6-7 years to develop because the clinical trials take 4 or 5 years. And all of this has been rushed. And this is a choice that has been made by governments and regulatory authorities, that the danger is greater. So I think that's absolutely valid. But that ambition has to be reflected at the global level, not just in terms of our own country. So the only thing I would disagree with Mr. Goldman is when he says that we should actually anchor the production capacities in Europe. That's the terrible thing about the US response as well. And that's not going to help the rest of the world. And it's not going to help the EU and Europe in the long run either.
Thank you, Jayati. I would have wanted to ask you something about the Biden administration's new funding of COVAX, and perhaps the funding that will go apparently directly to India for producing the vaccine. But we will unfortunately not have time for this. So I turn to Miguel, also because you probably, Jayati, already tackled one of the questions that we have pending by Michael Emerson. So what is the EU planning to do with the surplus vaccines or plans for distributing it to other countries? I don't know, maybe you can incorporate in your final comments, Miguel, that part too, if you have any updates on that.
Yes, thank you. Well, first to state that unfortunately there is no excess supply, there is no excess vaccines. We are all running to get as many vaccines delivered to our health system and inoculating to our people. Regarding this kind of race or competition and see who is more advanced than others, well, this is unfortunate, and we should not enter into that. Also because there are different ways of counting. Vaccines delivered, vaccines administered, 1 dose, 2 dose, full vaccination, full protection. When we look into the figures of citizens that have received the 2nd dose and therefore have reached immunity, then the European Union is just behind Israel and United States, much ahead of the United Kingdom. So this is a strategic choice by the British government to inoculate only 1 dose and protect, although not fully, but at least partially, a bigger part of the population. In the European Union, we have taken approach following the recommendations from the vaccine developers is that to give the full regimen to each person to achieve the highest safety possible. Let's see. I mean, it's very easy to say, maybe the UK was right, we were wrong, or the other way around. We will see exactly how it goes. We see now some interesting effects in Serbia, for instance. In Serbia, I cannot repeat the figure, but it's more than 20% of the population has received more than 1 dose. Today, there is 4 times more infection than it was on 1st January at the time the vaccination started. Because people relax, because many people are not fully protected, because Serbia is inoculating Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Sinopharm, and Sputnik all together at the same time with different protection. We're still all learning. And we're going to learn a lot, and we will need to adjust our policies and our strategies in the coming months.
Thank you, Miguel. I now turn to Professor Goldman, as we are really short with time. So sorry, Professor, to ask you to be very short, but maybe I can add to your already tough responsibility to be concise. The last question that we received, which is, what is, in your opinion, a reasonable time frame to handle the virus in the EU? So maybe you can obviously give us your tentative opinion as to when we will manage and under what conditions.
No, I will make a short answer, which will also be an answer to Miguel. The question is, what do we consider as handling the virus? As far as I am concerned, I think that if we end up in a situation where the virus is still there, but we avoid the more severe cases, that we end up in a situation which is a bit similar like the flu, this will already be a success. And that's why I think that the idea to immunize as many people as possible, even partially, was the right strategy. But it's true that we will see the jury at the end.
Thank you very much, Professor Goldman. I really thank all of you also for being so insightful in such a short time. We had a very rich conversation in only 1 hour. The only thing that we can say in this respect is that, as you probably realized, we will need to continue that conversation. To Jayati, when the Commission on Global Economic Transformation publishes its final report, we'll be happy to have you come back and see us. Same is for Miguel. Professor Goldman has been involved in some of our work at CEPS. We continue our work within the Periscope project, where we actually are looking at all data on policy responses to COVID-19, but also at the role of the EU in the global governance of healthcare. So you, the three of you as speakers today, will be invaluable partners in our adventure in Periscope going forward. And we will keep you posted on the results of our research as well. So thank you very much. This has been extremely insightful and useful, I think, also for all the participants. So I wish you a good evening, and hopefully we will all be right in the end. I mean, for the more optimistic versions of your presentations. So thank you very much again, and see you soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.